Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with loaded baked potato dip shaped like a football. That's right, a lot of people are just happy to get to a Super Bowl party. But not us, we want to win the Super Bowl party. In fact, this is that kind of dip at a party that people camp out in front of, and they pretend they're having a conversation, but they're really just chain dipping chips, like for 10 minutes. And then they act all surprised, like, oh, sorry, was I blocking the dip? Yeah, you were, for a long time. Okay, so if you do serve this, be prepared for that kind of drama. So first up, we're going to take care of the baconing, because what we're going to do is cut up and crisp up a whole bunch of bacon. And by a whole bunch, I mean 3 pounds. No, I did not misspeak. We're going to go ahead and slice up 3 pounds of bacon and toss it into our largest skillet. Then we'll take that over to the stove, and we'll cook that on medium heat until crisp. All right, so keep an eye on it. Give it the occasional stir. And as you may know, when you're cooking bacon, it doesn't really look like it's doing much at first. But eventually that fat will start to render out, and it should start to brown up nicely. And one little clue here, you're getting close. You'll see a sort of foam appear on the top. So when it looks like that, pay attention, keep stirring it. And when you think that bacon has reached optimum crispiness, we will safely and carefully transfer that into a strainer. And you can see really well here how far I want you to cook that bacon. All right, because this is going to be eaten at room temperature, we don't want a bunch of flabby fat. By the way, did I mention to put a bowl under the strainer? That's kind of a big deal. You only make that mistake once. So we're going to drain our bacon. And what's going to happen when that cools down to room temperature, we're going to chop it up nice and fine. All right, so we'll let that sit cooling, and we can move on to the actual base of our dip, which starts with a little bit of sour cream. We're just going to use 1 small 3-pound tub. And then before we add the rest of the classic loaded baked potato ingredients, let's go ahead and season this up with a little shake of cayenne and a nice big touch of freshly ground black pepper. And then, like I said, we're going classic loaded baked potato. So in addition to the sour cream, we need some extra sharp cheddar cheese and a whole bunch of chopped green onions and or chives. Now, if I was just doing a little bit, I'd probably use chives. But because I am doing such a large amount, I'm going to go ahead and use green onions, also known as scallions. So we'll take a spatula or a spoon and we'll give that a mix. And this is going to take a little while, especially if you used a way too small bowl like I did. So let me fast forward a few minutes. And at that point, it's pretty much ready. Except if you can, let this chill before you use it. All right, the colder it is, the easier it's going to be to shape. And by the way, I really do like the online grocery delivery services, but every once in a while something like this happens. I ordered plastic wrap, and that's what they gave me, except they gave me the Christmas version, which I don't like. But anyway, we're going to wrap that up and pop that in the fridge until we're ready to assemble. And that's pretty much it for our prep, except once our bacon is cooled to room temperature, we want to chop it up nice and fine. So pile it on a cutting board, take your biggest knife, and give it the old choppa until we have something that kind of looks like this. And at this point, we're ready to build our football-shaped dip. So I'm going to take a platter, transfer our dip onto it with a spatula, and as we do that, we'll kind of try to get a football shape, or at least something similar. And really, don't obsess over trying to get it perfect, because sour cream is pretty soft, so even if you originally get it into some kind of football shape that's nice and high, it will eventually kind of settle down, and you will have much more of a deflated football look. So here I was kind of trying to lift up the sides, make this thing a little taller, a little more shapely. But like I said, that sour cream's not that stiff, so it really does settle down from its own weight. But the good news is, right around here, I remembered that I'm going to cover this with 3 pounds of chopped bacon. So I stopped shaping, I cleaned up the edges a little bit, and then it was time to bacon the surface. So pile on that bacon, covering as much of the surface as you can. It's all right if a little peeks through. What, are people going to complain? So we're going to spread our bacon all over. I actually used all 3 pounds, and proud of it. And don't worry if it falls down around the sides, it's actually a good thing, because you're going to use that bacon to kind of press in and use that to give this its final shaping. So we'll go around, we'll apply our bacon, we'll press it in and shape it as needed. Once that's been done, let's clean up the tray a little bit, at which point it's time for our sour cream stripes and laces. So I'm going to take a piping bag with some extra sour cream, not the dip. That won't pipe. Just plain sour cream. And I decided to do the classic football motif, the stripes on either end and the laces in the middle. And one thing I did learn doing this, crumbled bacon is really hard to pipe onto. So that part did not come out quite as perfectly as I had envisioned. But then I realized nobody's going to care. We're about to eat 6 pounds of sour cream and bacon, so I quickly forgot about any irrelevant flaws and moved on to the final step, the beautiful green onion grass surrounding the football. So I chopped up some green onions. We will scatter that around to simulate beautiful fresh green grass or very high quality AstroTurf. And once we've done that, our loaded baked potato dip shaped like a football is done. Check it out. USA. USA. Come on, everybody. USA. All right, that's enough. I got dip to eat. And of course, since we're calling this a loaded baked potato dip, there should probably be some potatoes involved. So we will serve this dip on chips. And by the way, spend a couple extra bucks and get the thick, nice chips, which I'm going to grab one of right now and dig into this thing. And sure, it looked great. Sure, it looked exactly like a football, albeit slightly deflated one. Forget about the appearance. This tastes amazing. I mean, I hate to spoil it if you haven't had something like this before, but sour cream, sharp cheddar, green onions, and bacon taste really, really good on potato chips. And yes, there's some green onions in the dip, but of course I love to mix in some extra from the side. Fun fact, eating onions makes you live longer. True story, look it up. So if you're heading to a Super Bowl party where you're supposed to bring a dip, you could make and bring this and possibly get MVP of the snack table, okay? So I really do hope you give that a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Buffalo chicken dip. That's right, all the flavor, none of the bones, all of the taste, none of the groans. And yet still an incredibly delicious snack for your game day buffet. So let me show you how to put this classic baked dip together. And we're going to start with chicken. Now most of these buffalo chicken dip recipes call for canned chicken, which is really not what I want you to use. At the very least, go out and get yourself a rotisserie chicken. Just about every big supermarket in the world sells these. And one small rotisserie chicken will give you just exactly the amount of chicken you need for this recipe. And yes, you could roast your own chicken, of course. But you know what? You're really busy getting ready for a big party. It's okay. You can buy a rotisserie chicken. But anyway, we need some cooked chicken. I'm going to remove the skin and the bones. What about cartilage? Yes. Tendons? Of course. Remove those too. All right, so once I have just the meat, I'm going to take a cleaver and I'm going to cut it into kind of a small dice. Now you can go really fine here, almost like a paste, but I do like some decent sized pieces of chicken. So I'm going to cut mine just like that. I'm going to throw that in a bowl with a couple packages of full fat cream cheese, the real stuff. All right, please don't use the diet cream cheese for this. We only eat this once a year. Do you think we could just get it with the real ingredients, please? Thank you. All right, next we need our hot sauce. And of course, we're using the authentic Frank's Red Hot hot sauce. That's the original buffalo style chicken wing hot sauce. So we're going to pour that in. Blue cheese dressing and crumbled blue cheese. All right, after our blue cheese, I'm going to throw in the closest thing I have to a secret ingredient, some Old Bay. All right, and also some cayenne because Frank's hot sauce is really not that hot. And I definitely want this to have a lot of heat, so I sell more beer. So my guests drink more beer. And I'm also going to throw in a little bit of pepper jack cheese. And we'll also save a little bit of that for the top. All right, get in there with your spatula or your wooden spoon and mix it until thoroughly combined. By the way, buffalo chicken wings go with blue cheese dressing, not ranch. I don't know who decided to start serving ranch dressing with chicken wings. Probably some idiot, but it really doesn't go as well as blue cheese. You want that salty, sharp tang. Okay, once all that is mixed perfectly together, I'm going to transfer that into some kind of baking dish. You don't need to oil it. You don't need to grease it. I'm using just a deep-sided pie dish, but this will work in any kind of standard casserole dish. All right, so anything that's heat-proof. I'm going to go ahead and smooth out the top. And then before we pop it in the oven, we're going to go ahead and put on just a little more cheese. All right. So that's going to go in a preheated 400-degree oven for about 15-20 minutes until heated through. Now, one little trick I like to do towards the end here, I'll go ahead and flip on the top broiler for like 2 minutes just to brown the top a little bit. All right, that's optional, but I like to do it. And there you go. Our hot, ready-to-serve, baked buffalo chicken dip. I'm going to garnish with a little bit of cayenne just to sort of give people the visual warning that, yes, you are about to eat something that's hot. Be careful. All right, you probably want to let that cool a couple minutes before you put it out, but this is fine hot. This is fine warm. This is good room temperature. This is even good cold. And of course, I'm going to serve this up with some crackers and celery sticks. The celery, in case we have any vegans or vegetarians, I don't believe they're allowed to eat crackers. Okay, but I'm not sure. But just in case, we're going to have some celery sticks. And that is ready to taste. All right, it's going to be very runny and loose when it's hot. It definitely tightens up significantly as it cools. All right, let me get into some of this. It is so good. It tastes like creamy, boneless buffalo chicken wings. What's not awesome about that? All right, Super Bowl parties are coming up. You're supposed to show up with a dish to pass. And what do you usually show up with? A bag of potato chips. And what do your friends say behind your back? Dude, so lame. All right, so this year it's going to be different. You're going to show up with this. Super simple, inexpensive to make. Everybody loves it. Come on, this is a winner. Like those great philosophers, 69 Boys once said, if you ain't dipping, you must be tripping. And that is so true. So anyway, I really hope you give that a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts, as usual. And as always, enjoy. Sloppy dip. That's right, this is called sloppy dip because it's inspired by the Sloppy Joe, and not because it's perfect to serve to people that are sloppy drunk. Although, having said that, this is perfect for that demographic. But anyway, as always, we want to remind you to drink responsibly, especially if you're going to be attending one of these upcoming Super Bowl parties, which, by the way, this amazing hot dip would be perfect for. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this incredibly simple recipe. In fact, it's so simple that to start, we're just going to dump all our non-liquid ingredients into this pot. And first up, we're going to need a couple pounds of relatively lean ground beef, to which we will add some diced onion, as well as some diced green bell pepper. And then we will finish up adding our vegetation with a generous addition of minced garlic, at which point we can move on to our seasonings. So let's go ahead and toss in a little bit of brown sugar, which of course is hopefully going to balance out our spicy and salty elements. And then we will also add some freshly ground black pepper, as well as a very generous shake of cayenne. And as usual, the exact amount is up to you. You are, after all, the Matt Ryan of how much cayenne. And then we are definitely going to need some kosher salt, as well as a few tablespoons of all-purpose flour, which is going to help add a little bit of body to our dip. All right, we want this to be sloppy, but not necessarily messy. And that's going to be it for our non-fluid ingredients. And yes, we really do want to add all this to a cold pot, because what we're going to do next is move to the stove and place this over medium-high heat. And what we're going to do is break up and stir that meat while it comes up to temperature. And by starting in a cold pot, I think it's a lot easier to get nice small pieces. And I say small pieces, but what we're really going for is more of a paste. And not a whole heck of a lot's going to happen at the beginning. But as our mixture heats through, that salt's going to draw liquid out of the onions and the peppers and help us in the process of creating that meat paste we're going for, made up of millions, maybe billions of tiny pieces of meat. And fair warning, I'm editing this quite a bit. This is probably going to take you at least 15 minutes, maybe more. And by the way, any kind of spatula or wooden spoon will work here, but this flat-edged wooden spatula really does a great job. And you might be thinking, oh great, I don't have one of those. Maybe not. But if you do have one too many wooden spoons and a saw, you could have one. But anyway, we will continue to work that over on medium-high until most of that moisture has evaporated and our mixture sort of dried out and browned up and resembles something like this. And then what we'll do as soon as we've determined our mixture is cooked long enough is add the rest of the ingredients. So first up, we'll go ahead and dump in a whole bunch of ketchup, or as the waiter in the hotel I stayed in Italy called it, American sauce, which I found annoying and funny at the same time. And then we'll also toss in a nice big spoon of mustard. I'm using Dijon. And then we will also do a very carefully measured spoon of Worcestershire sauce. I don't know why people have trouble pronouncing that. It's quite easy. And then we will go ahead and finish this off with a couple cups of chicken broth, or water if you want. And then we'll go ahead and give that a stir. And then what's going to happen once those newly introduced ingredients heat through is it's going to start to simmer, at which point we will set our heat to about medium and proceed to cook this stirring for approximately 45 minutes or so, or until our dip reaches our desired thickness, as determined by you and only you. And one reason I like to add a good amount of liquid and cook it for a long time is so all those little tiny pieces of meat get really, really super tender, which sounds kind of funny because they're so small, but I really think you can notice a difference with one that's cooked a long time like mine than one that maybe had less liquid added and only simmered for like 15 or 20 minutes. So I simply let mine cook on medium for approximately 45 minutes or so until I was absolutely thrilled with how my mixture looked. And then once we determine this is cooked to our ideal viscosity, it is pretty much ready to serve. Although, as is customary, we will taste a little bit, mostly for salt. And since I'm going to serve this on sliced baguette, that's what I'm going to test it on. That just makes sense. So I gave mine a little taste, which was amazing. And once we're happy with the seasoning, we can move on to final assembly, which I should mention we're only going to do if we're going to present this as a baked dip, which I am. Okay, if you want, you could just keep that pot on low on the stove and not do anything, and use it as a dip as is. But it's been my experience that people drinking at parties seem to really enjoy things finished with melted cheese. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer my mixture into this saucepan. And then once that's set, we will apply half our shredded cheese. And then take a fork and give it the old poka. And in case you're wondering, I went with a sharp cheddar. So we'll go ahead and kind of stir and poke that in. At which point we will top with the other half of the cheese that we will not be poking in. And that's it. Once the second half of our cheese is scattered over, we are ready to finish that in a very hot oven. Or as I did it, under a hot broiler for about 5 minutes or so, until our top is hot and bubbling and looks something like this. And by the way, that's not grease on the surface. That is beautiful caramelized cheese. And some grease. But hey, anybody can make a baked dip that is unhealthy. I think it should also look unhealthy. And sure, I guess if you want to blot the top with a paper towel, go ahead. But since I use grass-fed beef, as you should, throwing away that omega-rich fat would be like throwing away medicine. But anyway, enough about how it looks. Let's place that next to some sliced bread and go in for a taste. And while I do enjoy the Sloppy Joe as much as any other red-blooded American, I think I like this sloppy dip even better, which could be the cheese. But no matter what it is, I just can't think of a better hot dip to serve at a party, sports-related or otherwise. And trust me, that relatively long cooking time really pays off here. Okay, not only is this stuff super flavorful, but because we did cook it for a relatively long time, that meat is very soft and tender, which I think is the key here. Oh, and by the way, to qualify as a world-class hot dip, it must be equally delicious at all temperatures. Okay, piping hot, warm, or room temp, this stuff is still amazing. In fact, believe it or not, this is even pretty good cold, as I discovered recently after returning from a trip to Mendocino. But anyway, that's it, sloppy dip. Maybe consider taking a little bit of a break from the usual chili recipe this year, since I think this would make a nice change of pace, yet it's actually pretty similar. So I really do hope you give this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Baked Cowboy Dip. That's right, the original name for this delicious dip has an extra word after cowboy that rhymes with whack, which we won't be using, but it really did make sense since this stuff is so incredibly addictive. But the part of the name that doesn't make sense is, what does this have to do with cowboys? That is the real mystery here, and nobody seems to know, but I think I solved it. And I'll give you my theory at the end of the video. But in the meantime, let's get cracking by cooking up some sausage. And before we do that, as usual, we'll have to remove the casing, which we do by slicing the sausage lengthwise like this, at which point we'll simply peel that casing right off. And that's it. We'll do that to both those, and then we'll head to the stove, where we will place these in a dry pan set over medium-high heat. And as soon as those start to sizzle, and some of that fat starts rendering out, we'll go ahead and perform the old cook and crumble. And all that means is we'll brown this up while breaking it up with a spatula. And a flat wooden spatula, as you see me using here, is my favorite tool. Or some people like to use a potato masher, but since I'm using a nonstick pan, that's probably not a good idea. And in case you're keeping score at home, I'm using 2 hot Italian sausage. And how small you crumble this and how much it browns is going to be up to you. And you can see here how far I went. And then once we're happy with how that looks and feels, we'll simply turn off the heat and reserve it until needed. Oh, and if there's a ton of grease in the pan, you can go ahead and drain some of that out if you want. Right, mine was fine, so I didn't. But just something to keep in mind. And that's it. Once that's set, we can move on to the actual dip, which will start with 1 pound of room temperature cream cheese, to which we will add some sour cream, followed by a whole bunch of grated extra sharp cheddar. And yes, technically any kind of melty cheese will work for this, but I really think that extra sharp cheddar works the best with the next ingredient, which would be 1 package of premium frozen corn, which we thawed and drained. And yes, I did say premium. All right, don't be buying any cheap off-brand frozen corn for this. All right, spend the extra $1 and get the good sweet stuff. And then at this point, we can go ahead and dump in our cooked crumbled sausage, followed by a can of diced fire-roasted tomatoes. And the brand I'm using happen to have some green chilies in it, which is fine, but yours doesn't have to, because we're also going to add in a can of diced green chilies. And not to brag, but these were hatch chilies. I also like to add in some freshly diced jalapenos for a little extra kick, plus some freshly and thinly sliced green onions. And then we'll finish up by seasoning with some kosher salt, some freshly ground black pepper, and of course a few shakes of cayenne. And believe it or not, that's it. We'll go ahead and take a spatula and mix this until everything's thoroughly combined, which is going to take a few minutes, especially if you forget to take your cream cheese out of the fridge and let it soften, which I always, every time, forget to do. But anyway, we'll go ahead and mix that up, and then we have a major decision to make. And that is, how exactly do we want to enjoy our cowboy dip? Okay, do we want to serve it in its raw, uncooked form? Or do we want to bake it and enjoy it as a hot dip like we're doing here? And the only way to know for sure would be to do some taste tests. So once this is thoroughly mixed, we'll go ahead and grab a few chips, and we will sample this in its cold, uncooked form, which I think is extremely delicious, and I'd have no problem with you serving it just like this. But having said that, I do think this is a little better once it's baked. which is why after a few test tastes, I'm going to go ahead and transfer this into a baking dish. And once that's been placed in, we'll go ahead and smooth out the top. At which point, if we want, and I do, we can go ahead and sprinkle on a little more grated cheddar, plus maybe a few more shakes of cayenne for good luck. And yes, in case you're wondering, you can definitely make this ahead, even the day before, and then just bake it when you're ready. And that's it. Once our dip has been cheesed and peppered, we'll go ahead and place that on a sheet pan so it's easier to handle. At which point it's ready to transfer into the center of a 425-degree oven for about 30 minutes or so, or until our cheese is melted and our dip is bubbling around the outside, around the outside, around the outside, and hopefully looks like this. Now that looks like something you want to dip a chip into. And then for a final touch, I'm going to go ahead and garnish the top with a few more sliced green onions. And that's it. Our baked cowboy dip is ready to enjoy, which I'm going to go ahead and do piping hot, next to some extra thick corn chips. And that, my friends, is just an absolutely delicious, wonderfully textured, highly addictive dip. In fact, once I was done filming, I just stood in front of this dish, eating chip after chip, until eventually I whispered to it, "I wish I knew how to quit you." So like I said, the old inappropriate name for this really did make sense. But what about the cowboy part? Right, there's no beef in this. And when's the last time you saw a cowboy pick an ear of corn or milk a cow? But I think I solved the mystery, since there is an old diced vegetable salad called cowboy caviar, which involves corn and beans and diced peppers and onions and a bunch of other vegetables. So what I believe happened is somebody took some leftover cowboy caviar and they stirred in some cheese and baked it. And this new creation was so delicious and so addictive, they ended up calling it cowboy. So until I hear a better theory, that is the origin story I'm going with. And while I do enjoy this better baked than in its raw, cold, uncooked form, I do not think this stuff is actually at its best and most addictive if it's really hot. Okay, by far my favorite way to eat this is after it's baked, but once it's cooled down. All right, for me, both texturally and flavor-wise, that's when it's really at its best. So if it's my party, I would actually bake this ahead of time so that it's had a chance to cool down before people start sticking chips in it. But anyway, as usual, those kind of decisions will be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the buckaroo of what to do. But whether you enjoy your baked cowboy dip hot, warm, or cold, or you don't even cook it at all, regardless, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Baked Reuben Dip. That's right, you know what they say. If it makes a great sandwich, it'll make a great dip. Well, actually, they didn't say that. I said that. But I really do believe it to be true, especially when it comes to the venerable Reuben sandwich. Plus, the big game is right around the corner. So I wanted to show you a nice hot baked dip with which to make the people that brought cold dips feel inadequate. I'm looking at you, Mr. Cauliflower Hummus. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the meat. So for this, we're going to need 1 pound of sliced corned beef, or in my case, pastrami. All right, corned beef is more traditional, and I believe the original Reuben meat. But personally, I do prefer the extra flavor that the pastrami provides. So obviously, that'll be up to you. You're the freak nasty of the dip. So you pick, but you can't really go wrong with either choice. But regardless of which one you use, we're going to prep it the same way. We'll just wad up a bunch of slices and cut it across one way, and then turn it and cut it across the other into, about 1-inch pieces. And by the way, I mentioned we're using a pound of meat here, which is literally twice as much that's called for in your leading internet recipes for this. And I only mention that to brag. But also, if you want at your party, you could describe this as high protein, okay? And then once our meat's chopped up, we will add that to a bowl containing the base for almost every hot baked dip, cream cheese. And please use the real stuff. I don't want you using that reduced fat stuff. And if you do, trust me, I'll hear about it. So we'll add our meat to a 1/2 pound of cream cheese, at which point we can introduce our sauerkraut, which has been drained, rinsed, and squeezed very thoroughly to remove any excess moisture. You see how that sauerkraut looks dry? That's because it's not wet. So you really do want to squeeze out any excess water, because you don't want that in your dip. And then in addition to that, we're also going to want to add some mayonnaise, as well as some sour cream, and ketchup, and mustard. And yes, I used the spoon with the ketchup on it to get my mustard, which is not the best technique. But since I already did it, I'll do it again. And then we're also going to toss in a little bit of sweet pickle relish, And by the way, if you made our bread and butter pickles and have those in the back of your fridge, just dice those up. They would work perfect here. And then after the relish, I'm going to go ahead and give this a few dashes of Worcestershire sauce. Nailed it. And then we'll also do some freshly ground black pepper, as well as a nice big pinch of cayenne. Oh yeah, it's back, baby. Seriously, I get emails if I go 2 videos in a row without using cayenne. It's crazy. And yet kind of sweet. But anyway, a little bit of cayenne, and then we could add the last ingredient, the cheese. So I'm going to toss in half a pound of grated Swiss cheese. And by the way, when I said Swiss, I did the air quotes. Because I don't want you just using any old regular commercial Swiss cheese. I want you to use what I used, which you will see on the blog with the rest of the ingredients. And then what we'll do is we'll grab a normally sized wooden spoon and mix this until thoroughly combined. Oh, and in case you're wondering, no, we didn't forget the salt. There's already enough sodium in this to start a small country. But anyway, like I said, we'll take a spoon and mix this up, which is going to take a few minutes. Which is why I'm going to edit this down to just a few seconds. Because let's face it, watching someone mix up a dip with a wooden spoon is just not that interesting. Although, you know what? Maybe from the side it would be more interesting. Nope, still not interesting. Hey, we tried. But anyway, we're going to keep at it until it's thoroughly mixed, at which point we can transfer that into some kind of oven-proof baking dish. Then we will use the back of our spoon to kind of spread that out, pressing it down, making sure it's all evenly distributed. And then once that's been accomplished, what I'm going to do is switch to a fork, because I don't want this surface to remain smooth. I want some nooks and I want some crannies. So all I'm going to do is go over the surface with the tip of a fork to kind of roughen it up a little bit. And not only is that going to be for appearance, but it's also going to create more surface area, which means those strands of sauerkraut on the surface are going to brown up even better. And I will explain why that's important later. So we will fork that surface and fork it good. And once that's been accomplished, this is ready to bake. So let's go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 25-30 minutes or so, or until bubbling and beautifully browned. Check it out. That looks incredible, and incredibly hot. So yes, we do have to let this cool down a little before we serve it. I'd say at least 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, if you serve it immediately, it's just going to be a little too soupy. Not to mention, to quote my friend Ralph, it'll taste like burning. Oh, and one pro tip while you're waiting for this to cool. If you put a few drops of water on a paper towel, you could easily clean off those burned-on smudges. Just makes it look a little nicer. But please be careful. If you're going to burn yourself, skip that step. But anyway, like I said, we're going to let that cool for about 15 minutes or so, at which point we can serve that up. Preferably next to some kind of pickles, and of course some bread or crackers. Obviously things like toasted rye would work perfectly. Personally, I happen to have some seeded pumpernickel crackers around, so that's what I used. And remember when I was forking the top, and I mentioned it was to increase the surface area so the sauerkraut would brown a little better? That's because there's something about browned, fermented vegetables that have the most incredibly delicious savory flavor. And I don't know chemically exactly what happens, but it is incredibly tasty. Oh yeah, you people that have had kimchi fried rice know what I'm talking about. But anyway, that little bit of brown sauerkraut is just one reason this is so good. And of course, all that delicious deli meat and half a pound of melted cheese don't hurt. So anyway, that's it, baked Reuben Dip. Just an absolutely delicious and beautiful monument to temporarily not caring what we eat. Which, by the way, is why we just eat this once a year. Without regrets. Repeat, no regrets. So I really do hope you give this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Classic guacamole. That's right, I'm going to be showing you how to make classic, traditional, totally authentic guacamole. Or at least my version. And I'm not sure exactly when you're going to watch this video, but today is National Guacamole Day. So I figured the timing was right. And I know it's not a real holiday, but neither is Valentine's Day. So we're not going to let that stop us. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started. And when you're making guacamole, there's basically two components. There's the avocados and there's everything else. And we're going to be starting with the everything else. So first up, we're going to slice some serrano peppers, which sort of look like small jalapeno, although they are significantly hotter. And yes, we are going to use the seeds and everything. Don't be scared, it's going to be fine. So we will slice those kind of thin, all the way down to the stem, and I'm going to do 3 of those. And then once that's set, I'm going to take a nice big pinch of cilantro and give that a little bit of a chop. And by the way, please stop shaming your friends that don't like cilantro. It's not their fault, it's genetics. All right, for 10% of the public, cilantro actually tastes sort of like soap. So don't force them to eat it, don't make fun of them. Just be happy you're not one of them. But anyway, we're going to give that cilantro a little chop, and then pile it up on top of our peppers. And then we're also going to take about 1/3 of a cup of diced white onions and add those to the pile. And then we'll take our knife and give that a brief chopping. And what we're basically doing here is sort of mimicking if we prep these ingredients in a molcajete, which is sort of a large stone mortar in which guacamole is traditionally made. So to simulate that grinding process, what we're going to do is give this a quick chop, and then we'll sprinkle over some kosher salt, or some other type of coarse salt. And then we're going to proceed with what I call the old smear and chop. So using the flat of our knife, we're going to kind of smear that against the cutting board, which again, we're trying to sort of simulate the grinding action in that molcajete. And it's that coarseness of the salt that kind of helps the grinding process. And by grinding these ingredients, we're releasing much more flavor than if we just chop this stuff up and toss it in with our avocados. So this step takes a couple minutes, but it's totally worth it. So what we'll do is alternate between smearing and chopping until we've reached as fine a texture as we want. So some people are going to leave this fairly coarse, while others will prefer to grind this down to a fine paste. But anyway, that's up to you. You are the Jeff Spicoli of your guacamole. But I don't go that far. I like to go until it's right about here. And then what we'll do once that's done is simply set that aside and move on to prepping the avocados, which you probably know how to do, but I'm going to show you anyway. But before we get to that, make sure you're buying perfect avocados. All right, we don't want them soft or hard. We want them firm but yielding. And really what it should feel like when you press is sort of like modeling clay. That for me is the best description. And then what we'll do to prep these is go ahead and take off that little stem thing. I'll assume that's not the official name. And we'll take our knife and slice in right there until we feel the knife hit that seed. And then we'll simply continue cutting around. And usually we don't cut towards ourselves. But since that seed is stopping the knife, there's very little danger. And then once that's been cut all the way around, we'll simply twist the halves. And voila, we have separation. But we're not done. We have to remove the seed. And to do that, we will carefully but firmly tap that blade on the seed, embedding it about 1/16 of an inch deep. And then all we have to do is give it a twist, and that seed will come right out. And please do not make the rookie mistake of trying to pull the seed off the knife. That is how you're going to cut yourself. The safe way is put your fingers on the other side and just push it off. See that? So easy, so safe. And sure, if you see any weird brown things, you can go ahead and scrape those out. I think that was a seed sprouting, but I'm not sure. But anyway, once that's halved and pitted, all we have left to do is take a spoon and scoop out that beautiful green flesh into a bowl. And I should mention, unless you're the world's slowest avocado scooper, you don't have to toss this stuff in lime juice. It's not going to turn brown in like 5 or 10 minutes. So some people like to squeeze in lemon or lime as they go. I see no need. So we'll go ahead and halve, pit, and scoop our avocado. And I usually do 4 large Hass avocados, but these were a little small, so I did 6. And once that's set, we can move into final production. So to our avocados, we're going to go ahead and add some more freshly chopped cilantro, as well as our beautifully ground onion and serrano mixture. And then we're definitely going to need to add another generous sprinkling of salt. Avocados are very bland unless you add salt. And then last but not least, we'll squeeze in some fresh lime juice. Or if you're super weird, some lemon juice. And that's it. We'll go ahead and take a potato masher and mash this until it reaches our desired texture. Oh, and I should mention, a lot of people do like to throw in a handful of diced tomato into this, which I like, but my wife Michelle is not a big fan, so I guess I don't like them after all. But anyway, we're going to take our masher and mash this until it's as smooth or as chunky as we want. Personally, I don't like mine too smooth. I definitely want to keep a relatively chunky texture. So I'm going to stop right about here, which for me is perfect. And then once we've determined that's been mashed to perfection, we are pretty much ready to serve, but you have to taste this. It almost always needs another pinch of salt, and quite possibly a little more acidity. Oh, and if you're wondering about cayenne, no. Classic guacamole does not have any cayenne in it. So please do not, when no one's looking, sneak in a couple shakes of cayenne. So anyway, we're going to taste and adjust those seasonings. And once that's mixed up, you can go ahead and chill that in the fridge, or transfer it into a nicer bowl and serve it up. And I guess garnish the top a little chopped cilantro, which is completely unnecessary, but I saw a little bit on the cutting board, so I tossed it on. And of course, make sure you have some chips around. And check it out, I poured a whole bag of chips into that basket, and not one single visible broken chip. Unbelievable. But anyway, that's it. Our classic, traditional, completely authentic guacamole is ready to enjoy. So let me grab a chip and go in and see how I did. And this stuff really is magnificent, which has very little to do with us. It's really the magic of the avocado. Okay, properly seasoned, there are a few things as uniquely delicious. And not to mention one of the world's healthiest foods. Avocado is one of the original superfoods, and so healthy for you, it will completely counteract the negative effects of the chips and the 6-pack of beer I'm going to drink with this. And while I've never had that theory verified by a medical professional, It sounds right. And apparently in this day and age, that's really all that counts. So anyway, that's it, guacamole. Like I said, we're doing this to honor National Guacamole Day. And what better way to celebrate a fake holiday than with a real great dip? So I really do hope you give this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Queso Dip. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make a cheese dip that's better looking, better for you, and way, way better tasting than anything you're going to get at the store. And of course, whether that amount of extra effort is going to be worth it is going to be up to you, and will depend on factors like how much you plan on drinking. But if you do decide to make your queso dip from scratch, you'll want to use this very easy and virtually foolproof technique. And to get started, what we'll do is grate about a half pound of cheese. And I usually don't film this, but it's come to my attention that some of you are still using pre-grated cheese, which I think is a terrible idea, since it's usually of lesser quality and coated with cellulose dust. So do me and your guests a favor, and take the extra minute or less it takes to grate this yourself. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I'm using a nice sharp white cheddar here, but any melty cheese will work. And sometimes I'll go with half Monterey Jack and half cheddar, since that's how they did it in the Mexican restaurant I worked at in college. So feel free to use whatever you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Jesus of your quesos. Which, by the way, is a much better rhyme in English. But anyway, no matter what cheese we use, once it's grated, we're going to toss it with 1 tablespoon of cornstarch. All right, just sprinkle it over and take a spoon and give it a toss. And then as soon as our cheese has been successfully starched, we will set that aside and we can move on to preparing the base of our dip. And for that, we're going to melt about a tablespoon of butter over medium-high heat, to which we will add some finely minced or crushed garlic, as well as some sliced green onions. And I'm just using the white and lighter parts here, but we will save some of the dark green parts to garnish the top later if we want. And then to our garlic and onions, we will also add a nice big pinch of salt, as well as a little bit of ground chipotle, which, as you probably know, is a smoked jalapeno. And we'll finish up with a little bit of cumin. And then what we'll do is cook this stirring on medium-high for just 2 minutes. Okay, we're not trying to brown or caramelize anything here. All we're doing is taking off the raw edge. So like I said, we will only give that a couple minutes before adding the next 2 ingredients, which would be a half cup of canned fire-roasted chilies. And I'm actually using hatch chilies here, but any of your popular fire-roasted canned peppers will work. As would, of course, freshly fire-roasted chilies. Oh yeah, you get extra credit for that. And then we'll also toss in some diced, seeded tomatoes. And we'll go ahead and give that a stir and cook this for like 2 minutes. And by the way, as you might know, I'm not a huge fan of using fresh tomatoes in the middle of winter. But I'm happy to report this is one of the few recipes where terrible supermarket tomatoes actually work pretty well. So this time at least we can include those without any shame. And then what we'll do after we've cooked our tomatoes and peppers for a couple minutes is add 1 can of evaporated milk, which depending on the brand you use will come in lots of different colors, none of which will be white. All right, they can range from a pale yellow to a light brown. But don't be concerned. Okay, that color happens because of the way the milk is condensed. Which reminds me, please do not accidentally use sweetened condensed milk. That will not be good. And what we'll do after stirring that in is wait for it to come up to a boil. Because once it does, what we'll do is give it a stir, and then carefully and confidently add our cheese. And we will stir that in. And the combination of our melting cheese plus that cornstarch swelling up in this hot liquid is going to thicken this mixture up. And then, very important, as soon as our cheese is melted, we want to immediately turn off the heat. All right, we never want to boil a cheese sauce because it will get all grainy and separated and not have a good texture. So as soon as that cheese melts, turn off your heat. And then we'll finish this up by stirring in a nice handful of chopped cilantro, if you're going to use it. Okay, if you don't like it, don't put it. It's not going to bother me at all. But I do like it, so I'm going to stir some in. And that's it. At this point, our queso dip is pretty much done. Except, of course, we have to taste it for seasoning, which we are not going to do off a spoon or our finger. All right, we need to use a chip, which have salt on them. And by tasting this on a chip, we will get a much more accurate gauge for whether we have to adjust the seasoning. And I decided mine needed a little more salt and a little more heat. So I gave it a few shakes of cayenne and gave it one final stir. And that's it. Once that's tasting exactly how we want, we'll go ahead and serve it up. Next to probably a whole bunch of corn chips. And I hope you like how those look. because those took me about 30 minutes to arrange. But anyway, we will serve that up and maybe top it with some more diced tomato, and possibly a little scattering of green onion, plus one last gratuitous shake of cayenne. And that's it, our queso is now ready for our queso. So let me go ahead and dip in. And that, my friends, as you can imagine, was absolutely delicious. And as I mentioned earlier, sure, this takes a little more work, but the taste and texture of this is so far superior than anything out of a jar. It is not even close to the same experience. Oh, and speaking of texture, as this stuff cools down, it will thicken up, but only to a certain point. All right, one of the things I love about this recipe is even when it's fully cooled, it still retains a beautiful, creamy, smooth texture. And above and beyond avoiding like a dozen ingredients we can't spell or pronounce, the beauty of making this from scratch is that you can easily tailor this to your own personal taste. Okay, we already said you could add different cheeses, but you could also add things like pickled vegetables, or maybe some roasted corn, or yes, even a handful of nice crispy bacon. But anyway, that's it, how I like to make queso cheese dip, which if you don't speak Spanish, translates to cheese dip. But anyway, whether you're going to serve this for the big game, or just any old time you're craving a delicious cheesy snack, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Chorizo Fundido. That's right, football season's here, and with it the need for new and exciting snacks. And what I was trying to do with this little experiment was create a cheese dip with meat. But what happened instead is I actually created a meat dip with cheese. And while too much meat in a dip is not necessarily a bad thing, I'm not exactly convinced yet it was a good thing either. But anyway, we'll analyze and discuss all that at the end. But before we can do that, we have to begin. And we'll do that by tossing some chorizo in a dry cold pan. And yes, that is a lot. That is 1 pound of chorizo pork sausage. And generally for a dip this size, I would use about half that. But I bought a pound and decided to see what would happen if I used it all. And then to that we will add some green onions, mostly the white and light parts, and we'll reserve the green tops for the garnish. And then we're also going to add a whole bunch of diced peppers. And I went with 3 different kinds. Some red bell pepper, which are sweet. Some beautiful dark green poblano chilies, which have a little bit of heat to them. And then last but not least, some fairly spicy jalapeno, which always work wonderfully in any kind of dip involving cheese. And what we'll do at this point is turn our heat on to medium-high. And as this mixture comes up to temperature, what we'll do is break up our sausage into very small pieces, using, of course, a smiley-faced wooden spatula. And if you're wondering what the deal is with this, it's actually kind of a funny story. But anyway, like I said, we're going to go ahead and break up this meat. And because generally chorizo has a good amount of fat in it, we didn't need to start with any oil to begin here. In fact, depending on what sausage you use, you may actually have to drain fat. So like I said, we'll go ahead and break this up into very small pieces. Or at least that's what I like to do. If you want to leave these in bigger crumbles, go ahead. That's certainly your right. You are, after all, the Tito Jackson of your Fundido action. But for me personally, texture-wise, I think the smaller the better. And then what we'll do once that's all broken up as shown is simply cook it stirring until it's browned and our peppers are just barely cooked through. All right, I don't want them falling apart. I want a little bit of texture to them. And then besides the crumbling and the cooking, we'll also want to check to see if we need to drain any grease. But as you can see, I really didn't have that much. So I skipped that step, but something to pay attention to. And it's never a bad idea to give it a taste, because depending on how salty the sausage is, we may or may not want to add some salt. But mine was nicely seasoned, so I'm going to use this mixture as is. And then once we're happy with this mixture, we'll simply turn off the heat and set that aside while we move into final assembly, which I'm going to do in this nice big stainless steel bowl, which I'm using not only because it gives me plenty of room to mix everything, but also because it's so dinged up and shows that I've been cooking for many, many years. In a way, it's sort of like a boxer's face, at least a bad boxer. But anyway, what we'll do at this point is toss in a half a pound of cream cheese, which really does not look like cream cheese. But that's because I'm fancy and live in San Francisco, so I had to use an artisan hipster brand, which was extremely dry and crumbly. Very delicious, but just not as creamy as that stuff from Philadelphia, which is probably what you should and will use. And what we'll do is go ahead and transfer our warm sausage mixture over the top, which will help soften that up and make it easier to mix. At which point we can go ahead and add the rest of the cheese, which for me was some sharp cheddar, either orange or white. It really is the exact same cheese. This one is just colored with annatto. It for me makes for a little better looking dip. And then we'll go ahead and finish up with a whole bunch of Monterey Jack. And by the way, yes, of course I shredded that cheese myself. As you well know, only a crazy person buys pre-shredded cheese. And then once we have all this together, all we need to do is give it a mix. Oh, and by the way, I should have mentioned by now, I did not invent the word fundido just because I thought it sounded cool. It's a term that simply means some kind of melted or molten cheese. But for the record, if it hadn't existed, I eventually would have thought it up. And then what we'll do once this is mixed until just combined is go ahead and transfer it into some kind of heat-proof dish. Because we're going to finish this under the broiler or in a very, very hot oven. And that's it. Once that's been transferred in and distributed evenly, our fundido is ready for the heato. So let's go ahead and pop that in about 6 inches under our broiler, which is set to high. And we'll cook that for about 5 or 6 minutes or until it looks like this. It should be nicely browned, possibly bubbling, and look like something you want to eat very badly. And obviously something this gorgeous could be served as is. But I decided to dress mine up a little bit with some diced tomato, as well as some sliced green onion from the tops we saved. And that's it. Our fundido is finito. No, I'm not getting tired of that. So let me go ahead and grab a chip and go in for a taste to see how this experiment worked out. And I decided to use a spoon since I didn't know how firm it was. And I thought it would be a bad look breaking a chip on the first bite. Although as you can see, the spoon didn't work out that much better. And it was right about here when I realized I might have put too much meat in this, since it was not as ooey and gooey as I had hoped. I mean, it was still incredibly delicious. And 0 people at your party would complain. But it really wasn't a cheese dip with meat. Like I said earlier, it was more of a meat dip with cheese. Although it did actually pass the ultimate dip test. Is it soft enough to scoop up with a chip and not have the chip break? Which it was. But as with all edible experiments, we can and will make adjustments, which you will read about on the blog. Alright, I am going to recommend we go with about half the amount of sausage, and quite possibly even mix in a little sour cream. But anyway, that's enough spoilers. I will just finish up by reiterating, despite the copious amounts of chorizo, this was extraordinarily delicious, and would make a very welcome addition to your game day buffet. And as far as culinary experiments go, this fundido was fun, indeedo. And with a few slight modifications, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Baked Chicken Parmesan Dip. That's right, I love chicken parmesan. And I love hot baked dips. So it was only a matter of time before I eventually did a hot chicken parm dip, which ended up coming out so amazingly delicious. I would make this again even if it was hard to do. But it's not. It's super easy as you're just about to see. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by prepping our chicken. And today I'm going to be using a couple boneless, skinless chicken breasts, which we'll go ahead and season very generously with kosher salt, freshly ground black pepper, and a little bit of cayenne. And while breasts are the classic cut to use for chicken parm, this would also work beautifully with some boneless, skinless thighs, as would just picking up a fully cooked rotisserie chicken and pulling the meat off that. But anyway, if you are using raw chicken, we'll go ahead and season that generously on both sides, at which point we'll head to the stove, where we're going to cook this in some olive oil over medium-high heat, which for breasts this size is going to take you about 6 minutes or so per side. And ideally we want these just barely cooked through, since don't forget our dip's going to get baked, so try not to cook these too well done at this point. Okay, even a little bit underdone is going to be better than over. And then what we'll do once we think that is just barely cooked through is turn off our heat and splash in about 3 tablespoons of cold fresh water, which is going to quickly cool down our pan, but also, and much more importantly, deglaze the bottom. Alright, if you're spending time scrubbing pans you're searing meat in, we seriously need to have a talk about deglazing. Since once we do this, that surface should be clean, and all that delicious goodness is going to go into whatever we're making. And that's it, we'll go ahead and transfer our chicken and pan drippings into this bowl, where we will let it cool down completely, at which point we can go ahead and dice it up and add it to the rest of our ingredients. And then speaking of the rest of the ingredients, while our chicken's cooling, we can go ahead and mix those up, which for me is going to start with some ricotta cheese, which could, if you want, be cream cheese instead. Okay, I kept going back and forth on which would be better, and there's really no way I'm going to know for sure until I try it both ways, which of course is what a real dip scientist would do. But anyway, to that we will also add a nice big pinch of our salt and pepper mixture. And then to our soft cheese, we will also add some grated cheese. And I'm going to do half mozzarella and half Monterey Jack, which is basically just like mozzarella, only it has a little more flavor. And then we will finish up the cheese phase with 1 ounce of freshly and finely grated Parmesan. And of course we're using the real stuff, Parmigiano Reggiano, except no substitutes. In fact, if you're stuck for a gift for a foodie friend of yours, just buy a hunk of Reggiano, wrap it up, and it'll be one of the best gifts they ever got. And then what we'll do before adding the rest of the ingredients is give this a quick mix with a spoon, just to make sure all those different cheeses are evenly distributed. And then once that's been accomplished, we can go ahead and add our now cooled and cut up chicken, along with, of course, all those precious pan drippings and accumulated juices. And as you can see, I dice my chicken, but you could also shred it for a little different texture. All right, that's up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the Brittany Street of how you prep your meat. And in case you're wondering, that's my niece's name, and she's the only person I know that likes chicken parm more than I do. But anyway, we'll go ahead and finish this up with a couple cups of marinara, or the prepared tomato sauce of your choice. And then we will take a fork and mix this until it's just combined. And then besides this, the only other thing we're going to need to prep would be a little bit of breadcrumb mixture for the top. So what we'll do is toss some panko-style breadcrumbs, since those are the nice big jagged ones. And we'll toss those right into that dirty bowl we had our chicken in. Because why dirty another one? Plus, this bowl came pre-flavored. And then to that, we will also add a nice splash of olive oil, at which point we'll take a freakishly small wooden spoon and give this a mix. And that's it, we'll just mix those until they're coated with oil. And once these are set, we can move on to final assembly, which means transferring our chicken mixture into an ungreased baking dish or pan. Oh yeah, you heard me, ungreased. Even though almost every other baked dip recipe calls for a greased pan. But we're not going to do that, because it really doesn't make any difference. And people just do it out of habit. And that's exactly the kind of brainless routine I want you to rebel against in the kitchen. And then what we'll do once our chicken is go ahead and top that with our oiled crumbs, before we finish it off with a little bit of our 3 grated cheeses. But please don't overdo it. All right, we just want a fairly light dusting of the Parmesan, and then just a little sprinkling of our mozzarella and Monterey Jack. Otherwise, what's going to happen if we put a whole bunch is once it bakes, it's all going to fuse to those breadcrumbs, and whoever takes the first bite is going to get like half a pound of cheese on their crostini. So please show a little bit of restraint. And that's it, once cheesed. This is now ready to transfer into the center of a very hot 450-degree oven for about 20 minutes or so, or until beautifully browned and bubbling, and looking exactly like something you want to see right in the middle of your snack table at your next party or festive gathering, which could be the same things. And then if you want, go ahead and serve this right away. But I feel like this really benefits from at least a 10-minute rest, just to let it cool down a touch. So I did let mine rest for a few minutes before serving it next to some beautiful homemade crostini. And then because every single chicken parmesan I've ever been served in my life has always come with a sprinkling of parsley, I decided to finish mine up with a little garnish of that. And that's it, our baked chicken parm dip is finally ready to enjoy. And of course, since we're calling it a dip, I have to give it the official test to make sure it is dippable, which it was. But names aside, I really do suggest you serve this with a spoon, because of people like me that will have no problem going in with the other half of that crostini. So if you want to prevent me and my double dipping fingers from going 2 knuckles deep, make sure you have a spoon or spreading knife next to this, which is not only going to be more sanitary, it's going to be way easier to get on the crostini. Theoretically. Don't worry, I'm going to practice. But anyway, no matter how you manage to get that on the bread, you're going to be enjoying something that pretty much tastes exactly like chicken parmesan. And unlike actual chicken parm, where that crispy breading usually gets soggy super fast, because we're serving this on nice crunchy toast, not only does this taste like the real thing, the textural experience is probably even better. So I really did enjoy everything about this. And for future party reference, it was good hot, warm, and room temp. Oh, and cold. And off the record, really good 2 days later made into a quesadilla. So for all those reasons, as well as the fact we're right in the middle of party season, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.
everything onion dip. That's right, we are not just calling this everything onion dip because we're using everything onion to make it with. We're also calling it that because it's everything you've ever wanted in an onion dip. And a few things you didn't even know you wanted. And now that I've covered everything, we can go ahead and get started with a little segment I like to call Meet the Onions. And in addition to some chives and green onions, we'll also be using some yellow onion and some red onion, as well as something that kind of looks like a red onion, but it's not. And that would be the relatively easy to find these days shallot, which I think is one of the keys here. So try to find those if you can. And then we can't do an onion dip recipe without reviewing how to dice an onion, which as you might know starts by cutting off both ends. After which we will place it cut side down and then divide it evenly in two right in the middle. And then of course we will remove the skin. And by the way, as you're doing this, if a couple pieces come apart, just put it back together and keep moving. Right, this kind of stuff happens all the time in the kitchen, and we can't let it get us down. But anyway, we'll go ahead and remove the skin. And then please note, an onion comes already divided into all these layers, which means it's basically already half cut for us. So all we have left to do is slice down like this, maybe about every 1/4 inch or so. And then once we've safely made those cuts straight down, we will simply turn the onion and start slicing across like this. And believe it or not, that's it. And there are certain recipes where we want to take our time and be very precise, but this is not really one of them. Or as long as all these pieces are roughly the same size, we're going to be good. But one thing I will add, you can control the size of the dice by how close together your cuts are. Right, both the cuts going straight down and when we slice across to finish the dice. So for a smaller dice, make your cuts closer together, and then for a larger dice, make them farther apart. Right, that's for you to dial in depending on what you're going for. I mean, you are after all the Mike Tyson of your onion dicing, so you decide on the size. But once you do, stick with it, so everything's fairly consistent. And then once we've given those the initial dice, if we do want them a little bit smaller, we can always give them the old choppa to break them down a little more. And then what we'll do once our yellow onion is exactly how we want, is we'll head to the stove where we have a large skillet set over high heat, in which we have a couple tablespoons of olive oil. And we'll go ahead and we'll transfer in our yellow onion, along with a generous amount of salt. And what we'll do here is saute these onions until they're nicely browned. And because we're using high heat, those onions are going to take on a nice deep brown color, but they're not going to have time to get super soft like caramelized onions, which as you might know, we do at a lower heat. So this is more of like a fast searing, and after about 7 or 8 minutes, you should have some nice color on these. And if you're into multitasking, while those were sauteing, you should have been dicing up your shallots and red onion, because once our yellow onions look like this, that's what we're going to toss in. And then we'll go ahead and lower our heat down to medium, and we'll give it a stir, and then saute all this together for about 3 or 4 minutes more. Okay, so we wanted to give the yellow onions a head start, so those will get a little bit browner and a little bit sweeter. And then what we'll do with the shallots and the red onions is basically just take off the raw edge and get them to the point where they start to soften and sweeten, but just barely. And that way hopefully we're going to get some different types of onion flavor. But wait, there's more. Once those are set, we'll turn off the heat. And then we'll add some granulated garlic, which is not garlic salt, it's just dried garlic, as well as a nice big spoon of minced dried onions. And with our heat off, we'll go ahead and stir those in. And if you're wondering, with all these onions, why do we need to put dry in here? And technically we don't. But if you want it to taste like the French onion dip of your childhood, whether that was store-bought or someone made it with a dried onion soup mix, if you want it to taste like that, make sure you add the dried onions. So to me, that's one of the key ingredients. And I think personally absolutely necessary. And that's it. Once that's been stirred in, we will let that onion mixture cool down completely before we add it to our dip, which will start with some mayonnaise, followed by at least twice the amount of sour cream. And please try to get the thickest, firmest sour cream you can find. Which reminds me, you can just do this with all sour cream if you want, but I think it is better with a little bit of mayonnaise, since that adds some extra fat. And then to that we will add some freshly ground black pepper, as well as a few shakes of cayenne. And then last but not least, assuming it's completely cooled, we will transfer in our onion mixture, which somehow as it sat got even more beautiful. And that's it, we'll go ahead and give this a very thorough mix. And no, we didn't forget our green onions and chives. Okay, if we're going to be using fresh uncooked onions, we always want to put those in right at the last minute. Since if we add those here, and then put that in the fridge for a few hours or overnight, the amount of that sharp raw onion flavor can actually increase, and depending on the amount, it can actually overwhelm the dish. And I really do think this dip's a lot better if we let it sit in the fridge for like 4 or 5 hours at least. And overnight's even better, to let all those beautiful cooked onion flavors develop. And then what we'll do before we serve it is go ahead and take it out and unwrap it. And that's when we will add our green onions and our chives. So we will go ahead and stir those in. And other than giving this a taste for seasoning, since it might need another pinch of salt, but other than adjusting the seasonings, our dip is officially done. And we can transfer that into a little nicer looking bowl. And maybe depending on our mood, we can garnish the top with a few sliced green onions and a little extra pinch of chives. And that's it, our everything onion dip is ready to enjoy, with everything and anything. But if you had to pick and could only serve it with one thing, that thing should be potato chips. And please have some respect for this dip and go top shelf when it comes to the chips. Okay, we don't want to defile this with some flimsy thin chips crumbling into it. Okay, so use something nice. And that, my friends, is the best onion dip I think you will ever taste. Just a tremendous amount of onion flavor, but all different types. Right, those sweet brown yellow onions, and then those slightly less well done red onions, and always delicious and savory shallots. And of course the nostalgic magic of those dried onions, all balanced perfectly with those fresh raw green onions and chives we stirred in at the end. Oh, and before I forget, a little message to those people I call dipscapers. You know, the people instead of just taking their chip and dipping it in, they have to like smooth over the surface and landscape it first before they dip. Right, that's a bad look. Just dip your chip and get out. Oh, and you didn't hear this from me, but if you end up with some leftover dip, which you won't, this stuff makes the best baked potato topping ever invented. Oh yes, it's almost worth making just for that. But anyway, whether you end up with leftovers or not, and you won't, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.